In a previous video, I briefly explained the importance of the proportional relationship between the shapes that makes up the patterns. But the proportional relationship is deeper and wider than the relationship between the shapes only. This relationship extends to include the relation between the shapes that makes up the composition and the perimeter of the composition itself. For that reason, it is very important to construct the pattern inside a specific perimeter, i.e. a square or a rectangle. In fact, the perimeter of the pattern has an important role in controlling the proportional relationship and the structure of the pattern. The fourfold pattern can only be constructed either in a square or in a certain rectangle. The rectangle should have a specific ratio between the width and the diagonal of the rectangle, and it is not possible to draw a complete fourfold composition correctly in a rectangle that does not have the correct ratio. We can establish the correct ratio for the rectangle from the square itself, and I will explain how it is done in the next video. But for now, let's deal with the case of the square first, because the number of fourfold patterns that can be constructed in a square is far greater and far more diverse. To explain the relationship between the pattern and its perimeter, I will use this fourfold pattern. At the start, I should mention that the diagonal of the square is the first and the most important key in any fourfold pattern. The diagonal of the square is the line connecting the two opposite angles of the square. The advantage of this diagonal is that it will divide the angles of the square into two equal angles, i.e. 45 degrees each angle. The second most important key is the difference between the diagonal of the square and the side length of the square. From these differences, we can extract all dimensions needed to construct the pattern. Furthermore, these differences will have full control over the distribution of the shapes inside the square. This is a fundamental rule that applies to all fourfold patterns in order to construct these patterns correctly. We can establish the first difference by drawing an arc centered in one of the corners of the square and with a radius equal to the side of the square. This arc will divide the diagonal into two segments. The long segment is equal to the side of the square, and the short segment is the difference between the two. These two segments from the diagonal and whatever difference extracted from them will control every single detail in the fourfold composition, such as the size of the shapes, their distribution, and everything concerning the construction of the pattern. In order to use this difference, we draw an arc centered at the opposite corner and with a radius equal to the small segment of the diagonal. This is the first circle based on the difference between the square side and the diagonal. Then we draw arcs with the same radius centered at the other corners of the square. The importance of these circles will become clear when we draw lines between the corners of the square and the intersecting point of the circles with the side of the square. Now the magic of these arcs become visible, because these lines, with the help of the arcs, will divide the 45-degree angles into two equal angles, i.e. 22.5 degrees each angle. These circles, lines and angles are very important, because from the intersections of these circles with the side of the square, and from the intersection of these lines connecting these points, we will be able to extract new and important circles. To establish the second difference, we draw a circle centered at the intersection of the two diagonals and with a radius equal to the difference between half of the diagonal and the small segment. Notice that this circle can also be used to divide the angles of the square into 4 equal angles. Now we draw 4 arcs with the same radius at the corners of the square. And I stress once again that all 4-fold patterns undergoes this procedure, and only few very simple and basic patterns are excluded from this procedure. In fact, almost all patterns start with these steps, whether they are constructed in a square or a rectangle. Next, we draw lines connecting the points where the small arcs intersect with the side of the square. And notice that these lines intersect at the exact point where the big arcs intersect with the diagonals. These intersections will serve as a focusing point in the composition where the stars and the large shapes are located. But these are not the only important focusing points. In fact, most intersections can serve as a focusing point as well, and by drawing lines connecting the intersecting points of the big circles with the side of the square, we can establish more of these focusing points. The next step is to establish the third circle needed for this pattern. We do that by drawing a circle centered at this point and with a radius equal to this distance, i.e., the distance between the center and the intersection of the diagonal with the horizontal line. Now we draw circles with the same radius centered at this point, and another circle centered at this point. Then we draw arcs with the same radius centered at the 4 corners of the square, and this point, and this point, and this point. Then we draw arcs with the same radius centered at this point, and at this point, this point, and finally at this point. These circles will form the outside perimeter of the stars and the large shapes. Next, we need to establish the fourth circle needed for the construction of this pattern. We draw a circle centered at this point with a radius equal to the distance from the center to the intersection point of the diagonal with the horizontal and vertical lines. Then we draw the same circle centered at the center of this circle and centered at the center of this circle. We also draw arcs with the same radius centered at this corner and centered at this corner. And we draw more arcs centered at this point and finally at this point. These circles will form the inside perimeter of the stars and the large shapes. Now we need to establish the last circle needed to finish this pattern. Once again, we will use the difference between the circles extracted from the square diagonal. We do that by drawing an arc centered at this point where the large arc intersects with the square side, and with a radius equal to the difference between the large arc and the small arc. Now we repeat drawing the same size arc at this point, and a third arc at this point, and at this point, and a fifth arc at this point, and finally arc at this point. The final step needed to finish the construction lines is to draw lines between the points where these arcs intersect with the sides of the square. Notice that these lines pass through the intersection of the circle and the horizontal and vertical lines. If they don't, then that means there is something wrong in drawing the construction base. Now we begin to draw the pattern itself. As you can see from this composition, the difference between the length of the diagonal and the length of the square side plays a vital part in determining the proportional relationship between the different shapes in the pattern structure. In fact, these differences control the interlocking of these shapes with each other and help to distribute them evenly within the square area. This fundamental rule and concept applies to all fourfold compositions, whether the patterns are simple, complex, or compound. The grid method, used by almost all authors and becoming popular recently, does not encompass such relationships and proportions. As I illustrated in other videos, constructing geometric patterns with the grid method can lead to distortions, even in the very basic and simple patterns. Complex and compound patterns, and even moderate complex patterns, need high degree of accuracy. Even a small difference in any shape can result in distortion in the rest of the composition. This distortion can accumulate and infect the adjoining shapes, and that will lead to a big and visible distortion in the pattern. It is also important to mention that through this base we constructed now, we can develop several different patterns. All the patterns you see now are based on the same structure we have just created. This means that all these patterns are proportional with each other. Thus, we can merge them together to create new patterns. For example, we can take half of this pattern and merge it with the previous pattern to get a new composition. In the next video, I will describe the process of establishing the correct proportion of the rectangle that is used to construct the fourfold pattern. And thank you for watching.